questions continue to be raised about why President Cyril Ramaphosa's security delegation was blocked from proceeding to Ukraine and Russia. They were part of the Africa Peace Mission led by the President of South Africa. One day after their return, the presidency still has not explained what happened. There are also calls from the EFF for the Polish embassy to be downgraded and the Polish ambassador to be expelled from the country. Newzroom Afrika's Govan Whittles was part of the media contingency that was stuck with the President's protection services. He's back in the country, home safe. Hello, Govan, how are you doing? How are you feeling?
Very well, thank you, Tulu. Yeah, good to be home.
Good to have you back home. So the question that has been raised, and whether it's security experts or whether it's international relations experts, did South Africa have the requisite permission when it comes to the protection services of the President to bring the weapons into Poland, rather?
The Polish say South Africa didn't have permission to bring the weapons into Warsaw, even if it was just for transit to a city on the border of Ukraine where they would have moved on. And they're also saying that some of the people on board the flight didn't have the necessary documentation to proceed. But the Presidential Protection Services insist they did have the permits. This is a tricky situation. Firstly, we've been told as journalists that they can't say officially what happened because this is a security matter. That comes from the presidency. They say that we should ask the police what happened with the flight. But, of course, the requirement to book the permits and to arrange them so that the weapons can travel through that country rests with the Presidential Protection Services. They didn't want to show us the permits. So this is the version of events. We arrive in Poland, in Warsaw, and we all take our bags, start standing up in the plane, think that we're about to get off. And then we notice that we're on the far edge of the terminal. So as soon as we landed, the air traffic controllers at the Chopin International Airport in Poland ushered the South African plane to the furthest edge of the terminal building. That's about 1.5 kilometers away from the terminal. We were with the cargo planes. There were no other passenger planes there with us. And then right next to our plane was the perimeter fence of the airport. And as soon as we touched down, the Polish media were already set up with cameras outside the fence. Clearly, they had been told that we were about to land, so we didn't know why they did that. So we stand up in the plane, we think we're going to disembark. Then we realize, nothing's happening. And an hour goes by, nothing's happening. Only about 7 hours later does the head of the presidential security call us to the front and say, come see what's happening. There are police here. They're threatening to confiscate our weapons if we offload them, take them out of the containers. And at this point, they raise the issue of the permits. So the PPS head, Major General Wally Rhoda, says they had the permits. Not only did they have the permits, they sent an advance team to Warsaw with the originals, and then they flew with the copies. And when they arrived, they presented the copies, and the Polish refused to take the copies as being legitimate. And they contacted their person in Warsaw, who was part of the advance team. That person came to the airport. Took 4 hours to reach the plane, which was about 1.5 kilometers away from the terminal, was strip searched in the process while having a diplomatic immunity passport, and then showed them the originals, and then they still didn't want to let them off the plane. Let's take a step back and listen to what Wally Rhoda had to say. This is him talking on the steps of the plane because we still weren't able to disembark at that point. Let's take a look at what the Major General had to say.
They are delaying us, right? They're putting the life of our president in jeopardy because we could have been in Kiev this afternoon already. Right? And this is what they are doing. And I want you guys to see this. Right? How racist they are. When we started to open packages, right, they wanted to rush, right, to confiscate our firearms. That's why we had to put it back. It was absurd. It has never happened that we have sent anyone with a diplomatic passport just to get us out of here. Now, they say we don't have permits. We have permits. The only difference is now they say we can't bring a copy of a permit. We bring the original.
Because another question that is being raised, Govan, is why the president needed so much security detail. We understand it was over 100 people. We don't even know the team that went ahead, how many people there were. And so how many containers were there? And were all those containers that we just saw, were there weapons in there? And
luggage, obviously clothes that belong to some of the protection services. But yes, most of that was weapons. So it's 100 people. That's at least 100 weapons that were being taken along. The type of weapons we understand them to have been were sniper rifles, obviously usual pistols. We spent some time with these guys, most of them not allowed to talk to us, but I mean, stuck in Warsaw for 2 days. We had a few conversations. They explained some may have been semi-automatic weapons, but still none of that representing an arms cache in any way. It certainly wasn't being perceived as being that from the security side. And in terms of the size of the delegation, the explanation we got from our side was that they needed this delegation, which is essentially split between the two countries with about 60% meant to go to Ukraine, because of the route that the president was taking. So since the airspace was closed in Ukraine, you need to take a 15-hour journey by train from the Polish border to reach the city of Kyiv. These guys weren't necessarily going to be around the president, but to be posted at different locations where the president would be, such as the site of the mass grave, which the Ukrainians say is a result of what was perpetrated by the Russian forces, and then obviously in Kyiv, in the capital city, and a number of other locations. That's just our understanding of where they would have been. Obviously, we don't have specific information on the exact locations they were going to be. And then the rest in St. Petersburg in Russia, also at different points where the president was interacting. So they said they were advanced team. And to be fair, this trip, of which the preparation was very secret, and we weren't allowed to say anything about our intention to travel to this area. We were explicitly advised not to report on it beforehand. Remember, even in the presidential briefing by the spokesperson the day before we went, the spokesperson said the president was only going to Geneva for that International Labour Organization summit. He didn't mention that from Geneva he would fly to Poland to attend to the African Peace Mission. That's the level of secrecy that was around this. But now that we're back, we could say that we had been trying to arrange to go to Poland, Ukraine, and Russia for at least 2 weeks before. In fact, we were supposed to have left 1 week earlier than we did. And there were a number of delays because of the continuous negotiations with the other heads of state. But they insist that the size of this delegation was necessary. Let's take a look again at the commentary from the analyst you had spoken to earlier. In fact, I think it was part of former President Mandela's security detail, about how this is usually done. And what kind of permissions are sought. We have established that there were questions being raised about the permits in South Africa by other security officials. But as we heard from the Major General of the PPS, they believe they had the right permits. They had the copies, they had the originals. They say they had everything in order. When we flew over Turkey, or on the way to Turkey over Italy, and we were told to circle before entering the Italian airspace, they said they did that despite them having secured the permission to fly over Italy initially, and having to re-secure that. So there clearly appeared to be an issue there. But this is what the former security officer or member of the PPS for former President Mandela had to say about how this situation is really handled and what kind of care you need to take.
The risk of embarrassing your principal, especially if you think in our day, President Mandela's international image was massively important to us, and we would never have done anything that would in any way seek to diminish or to damage that. So that would be my comment, Lulu. Those permissions needed to have been in place, watertight, signed, sealed and delivered. Whether those were originals or copies isn't the point. They needed to be properly communicated, proper approval obtained prior to them leaving. Otherwise, they shouldn't have taken those weapons for which there was no prior approval, in my view.
And then in comes the media. What were you briefed about your role? I think you touched on it a little bit earlier on, and the veil of secrecy that surrounded everything. Did you get the necessary permission? And also, who paid for this trip?
Yeah, we did get the necessary permission. Newzroom Afrika took out a lot of money to make sure that we were able to get onto that plane. We had to pay for our own Russian visa, which, because of the last-minute arrangements, was charged to us at an emergency visa price, which is not cheap. We also had to pay for our own Schengen visa. Once we were there, we booked our own accommodation, that which was forfeited now by our company because we never made it to Russia, and we had booked accommodation on that side. When it became clear that we would have to disembark and stay in Poland, we had to pay for our own hotels. While we were in Poland, paid for our own food. What happened here is that the invitation was extended to us as a lift on the airplane, which was being chartered by the presidency. Not at our request, but they had offered us a lift and said that we could cover the African peace mission. So what was being arranged for the press was the lift on the aircraft, which would take us to the Ukraine and to Russia. Once we were in that area, they were going to organize the buses for us to go around. Eventually, they only organized a bus to bring us from the airport to the hotel in Warsaw, and a bus to take us from the hotel back to the airport again on the final day. And then they would, as we did on the previous diplomatic trip to London, although we paid for the accommodation and the flights then, they organized accreditation with the official government agencies. This time, of course, nothing happened. So there was no need for any accreditation. There were also a number of other miscellaneous costs incurred by our company here. So this wasn't a case of embedded reporting. We were there to report objectively, and right now we're waiting for a statement from the presidency. A lot has happened, and there were serious infringements alleged by the Presidential Protection Services, for which we're hoping the presidency will clarify. We've been told that they're not going to do so. But until they do, the only official statement on record about what happened is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Poland, which says that they didn't have permits for the weapons and they didn't have the correct documentation. Of course, there are other geopolitical factors here which are obvious based on how we were treated. And we'll get into that at a later stage. We should also point out that most of the Presidential Protection Services and the police, they hold diplomatic passports. So the allegation that they didn't have proper documentation is neither here nor there. And there did appear to be some wrangling of political forces in the background, probably linked to the question of where those weapons were going. And then we get into the discussion of Lady R. But we hope to unpack that through the afternoon.
Just very quickly for us, Govan, I think it was in the Sunday Times where they alleged that there was a conversation that was had prior to this trip about the return of a prisoner from South Africa, a Polish prisoner. Were there murmurs about this at all during your time there?
No, none that we were aware of. As far as we were aware, the negotiations between the South African Presidential Protection Services and the police were hostile and didn't achieve much, if anything. And those kind of negotiations would have happened during the presidential check-in with his Polish counterpart, which we understand didn't last for more than a half an hour, which is highly unusual for a president to check in with his counterpart and then be back on the plane within 45 minutes. So there did appear to be tension from that moment, and that needs to be explored because, of course, after our president visited the Polish president and then made his way off to Ukraine, the negotiations to let us off the plane deteriorated significantly. With him was our international relations minister, Naledi Pandor, who we have confirmed didn't have extensive discussions with the Polish counterpart during that check-in in Warsaw. Okay. So we'll get into the rest of that this afternoon.
Would you do it again?
Yeah, I definitely would. It's a very memorable experience. It's certainly going to determine future relations between South Africa and Poland. And just for the record, being on the plane, stuck on the plane, it wasn't that bad. It wasn't that uncomfortable either. And also thanks to the SAA staff who took good care of us, and thanks to the Embassy of South Africa in Poland who sent us Burger King when we ran out of food. Really not that bad when you consider how it was or how it appeared back home.
Thank you very much. Good to have you back home. Govan Whittles, Newzroom Africa's reporter. Still to come, National Association of School Governing Bodies is proposing or is rather cautioning against the practice of sexual misconduct between teachers and pupils. They'll tell us why in a few moments.